We are live. Welcome, welcome to everyone joining us on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and on Drisha Live for the first session in a three-part class entitled What Stops the Plague with Ms. Miriam Gedwiser. So I know that plenty of you have studied with Miriam before. Excuse me, one moment.
Studied with her in one case, birthed. Yeah.
But I will ask to be indulged to give a little introduction anyhow. So Miriam Gedwiser is a faculty member at Drisha and teaches Talmud and Tanakh at the Ramaz Upper School. She has a BA in the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Science and Medicine from the University of Chicago and a JD from NYU School of Law. Miriam studied at Midreshet Lindenbaum and in the Drisha Scholars Circle. She previously practiced commercial litigation at a large law firm and clerked for the Honorable Deborah Freeman. I don't know what USMJ means. I'm sorry.
Judge.
Okay, a judge in Manhattan. Miriam serves as a guest lecturer at synagogues and programs around the Northeast and has written on topics of Jewish and Torah interest for the Lair House, The Forward, the Center for Modern Torah Leadership blog, and Project 929. Miriam lives in Teaneck, New Jersey with her family. And this class, by way of introduction, plague is one of God's preferred forms of collective punishment in the Bible. Just as plagues often start in reaction to human misdeeds, they can often be stopped by human action as well. What stops a plague? How can individual actions, even extreme ones, change the balance of the public's guilt in God's eyes? To answer these questions, we will examine depictions of plague and how it can end through the lens of rabbinic texts, including the story of Rabbi Akiva's students and the abrupt cessation of their plague-related deaths. So I know we're all very excited. That's why we're here. And I'd just like to remind those of us on Zoom, if you can have your camera on to give a little classroom vibe, that's very nice. But please stay muted unless we're having a discussion period. And if you don't feel comfortable using your microphone during discussion period, just pop your questions and comments in the chat and we will make sure that we take a look at them. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you are also free to leave questions and comments in the comment section there, and I will bring them over here unless you want to bring yourself over here and join the party on Zoom. But otherwise, let's get started.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for joining. So I hear the description and I'm going to make the first confession, which is I didn't exactly do what I said I was going to do, so I hope you'll forgive me. The idea for this course, was in part, I think, or this whole theme of this session at Drisha was in part based on, ideas of the plague of Rabbi Akiva's students, obviously like our own sort of plague time in 2021, but also this being a time when Jews have historically thought about plagues because of the sort of I don't know what to call it, the story, we can call it, of Rabbi Akiva's students dying from plague during this time. So that sort of was the anchor. And today, since Lag BaOmer is coming up this week, I felt like I would use the first session before Lag BaOmer to talk about that story. And it's much less about what stops the plague than what starts the plague, but maybe it also has some little bit of an eye towards what prevents the plague, or what's the opposite of that. So I don't want to get too much further ado. I know many of us may have different levels of familiarity with the story of Rabbi Akiva and his students and their dying during the plague. So I hope that there will be something new for everyone, but I'm also going to try and make sure we're all on the same page. Great. So I'm going to share my screen. That will be the beginning. And here it is. And I'll try and make it a little bigger. Did that work? No. There you go. Okay, so the story of Rabbi Akiva and his students, right? I'm just going to say at the outset, I'm like totally, there's lots of interesting questions about historicity of this, right? First of all, what really happened? Did something happen? What were the rabbis trying to talk about when they say what they're going to say? People know more about that than I do and are more interested in it. I'll mention just these things as they kind of come up, but I'm reading this as a story,
That's what I do. Okay, so this is the passage from Yevamot. It really starts on the page before with the Mishnah, and our Gemara is from 62b. So the Mishnah is about, in Yevamot, about whether a man can, what they say, translate in English as neglect, right? Yivatel piria v'rivya, right? The commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Meaning, can he either, well, not marrying is maybe a separate thing, but can he marry a woman who's known not to be able to have children, for example, right? So it says, the Mishnah says you can't do that, you, the male subject of the Mishnah, right? Ella in Cain yeshlo banim, right? Unless he has sons, children, let's say children, because we're going to talk about which kind of children in a second. Beit Shammai rim shnei zacharim. So Beit Shammai say, unless you already have two sons. Beit Hillel rim zachar nekevan. Beit Hillel say a boy and a girl. This is the source of like the famous halacha that you're supposed to have a boy and a girl, right? Shneimar zachar nekevan baratam. So Beit Hillel has a pasuk to prove their point. I'm just using this to situate our story, right? Where the Gemara is going to talk about, like, well, is that really true? Does it really not matter if you have more kids? If you already have kids, should you not try and have more? And again, we're like, this is sort of not really a contraception universe. I mean, they had contraception or things they thought were contraception, but like, this is about, right, can you choose to marry somebody who's infertile, right, for example, or maybe to not get married at all. So the Gemara says, Manitin de lav Rabbi Yeshua, our Mishnah, which says, once, two and done, doesn't follow the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, who says in a Braita, Rabbi Yeshua mer nasa adam isha b'yalduto, isha isha b'ziknuto, right? If a man marries a woman in his youth, he should marry a woman in his old age. Hayulu banim b'yalduto, yulu banim b'ziknuto, right? And seemingly relatedly, right? If he had children early, he should also have children later. Shene Amar, as it says, the pasuk in Kohelet baboker zera et zarecha v'la erev al tanach yadcha, right? You should sow your seeds in the morning and don't give up in the evening. I don't know. Because you never know which will work out better, or maybe they're both good, right? If it turns out, right, in basically two of those three scenarios, you'll be glad you had the second group. Because if they're all good, that's great. If only the second group is good, then you're really lucky that you chose to have them, right? And if only the first group is good, well, at least you have them, right? This gets sort of legalized, we could say, or halachified in contemporary halachic discourse about contraception and other things as like a mitzvah dirabanan of la'erev, right? Or there's sort of mitzvahs. I don't know if it's really right. There are other mitzvot that are based on other psukim as well, but right. I'm not interested in that for the purposes of this, right? The Mishnah says once you have children, maybe you're done. Rabbi Yeshua says no. You should try. You never know what's going to come of your children of your youth or the children of your old age, so you should have both. But the reason that's interesting to us is because now we have an opportunity for other rabbis to read the same pasuk, and that's going to bring us to our story. So Rabbi Akiva Omer, Lamad Torah b'yalduto, yilmod Torah b'ziknuto. Rabbi Akiva says, well, actually, it's not about having children when you're young or when you're old, right? If you learn Torah in your youth, you should learn Torah in your old age, which is interesting because we know from other legends of Rabbi Akiva, which you could probably hear me reading in recordings on the Drisha website from this time last year. But from other legends of Rabbi Akiva that he's often said to have started to studying very, very late in his life. So it's sort of interesting that he's saying, whether you learned young, even if you learned young, you can sort of you can come back to learning, which is an interesting thing to say, meaning what does that mean that you should learn it again? Maybe he's talking specifically about Torah, right? He's saying you should come back to the sort of the beginner text with a new eye. Maybe he's saying you should make time to be a student in your old age and not just sort of be a teacher who's always on call or something. It's sort of an interesting claim, but his real claim seems to be the following. Hayulo talmidim b'yalduto. If you had students when you were young, yulo talmidim b'ziknuto. You shouldn't be like, oh, I already have students, I can move on to other things. You should continue to teach students even as you get older. Shneimar baboker zera et zarecha. As it says, right, sow your seeds in the morning and in the evening because you never know which is going to work out, right? And it seems like the story of Rabbi Akiva is going to show exactly that, right? You might think you've done great and you can stop teaching students, but actually sometimes that whole plan doesn't work out and you need plan B. Okay, so Amru, they said, who is the they is an interesting question. It seems like most people seem to think that this is quote unquote the Gemara talking, right? This is not a continuation of any sort of actual statement of Rabbi Akiva. It's going to be attributed to Rabbi Akiva in Kohelet Rabbah, which is a later text, but okay, right? Amru Shnei Masar Elef Zugim Talmidim Hayula Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students. People talk a lot about why we talk about them in as pairs. Why don't we just say 24,000? As we're going to see, another text might just have 12,000, but okay. So he had these pairs of students, Migivat v'ad Antiparis, right? Antipatris. Oh, it's not spelled in English and Hebrew in the same way. Fine. So basically, spanning this whole area of Judea, the Chulan metu b'perek echad. Mipnei shalom nahag, right? So they all died in one perek, one sort of like a chunk of time, right? Because they did not treat each other with respect, or they didn't sort of like behave with respect to each other. So, okay. As I said, right, I'm just going to mention, right, there's a lot of people who like to talk about, I thought this was like a, a modern historical thing. It's actually, apparently it comes up in like quasi-modern or slightly pre-modern texts also, the idea that maybe some of these students were the Bar Kokhba fighters, let's say, and that Rabbi Akiva was sort of their supporter, and then when they all died, that was sort of the crushing of that revolt. But be that as it may. V'haya olam shameim, right? And then the world was desolate. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva etzel rabotenu shebadarom, until Rabbi Akiva came to our rabbis in the south, right? The rabbis who become the rabbis of the Mishnah, it sounds like. Ushna alahem, and he taught it over to them. Right, Rabbi Meir, right, and I think that use of the word like lishanot is just the word in general for teaching, right? Teaching Mishnah, teaching the teachings of the rabbis of this time period, the Tanaim, right? You show them, you repeat them over because people are learning them by heart. But it's also interesting because it's not just that he's repeating the Torah, which is how you teach Torah, but he's also repeating his whole process, right? He's starting again with new students. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar. Right, so these are his people: Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua, who are in some ways, right, some of the major Tanaim of our Mishnah. Right, Rabbi Shimon, by the way, is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We tend to forget that when we're learning Rabbi Shimon's halachic opinions, that actually, like, he's sort of become extremely famous as this really intense mystical person. But okay. The Torah Tasha, and they're the ones who kind of were able to make the Torah, to uphold the Torah at that time, right? And here it seems almost like Rabbi Akiva got lucky in a sense of like the first students died, but he had enough time to do the second, and his advice is kind of like, well, don't wait for it to fail, just like always be ready. Right? Here there's a period where there's like all these students and they die and the world is desolate, but then we can start again. What you could have prevented that desolation almost by sort of like being prepared. So this is what the Gemara has to say about this plague, right? Well, it has one more little box of things to say about it, right? So they all died in one passage, right? Because they didn't treat each other with respect, right? Whether that's like some sort of a metaphor for the failings of the Bar Kokhba revolt, I don't know. But okay, so we're going to spend a lot of time, hopefully, talking about what that means, lo nahagu kavod ze lazeh, and what it entails, and what the antidote might be, other than like being polite, which is sort of an easy way to think about it. But let's just finish this thought, right? So Tana, again, this may or may not be an actual braita, but it's presented as a braita. Kulam metu mipesach ba'atzeret. They all died from Passover to Shavuot, right? And again, just like as a historical anecdote, right, it seems like one of the reasons that the mourning period that we attribute to these students dying in the 2nd century of the Common Era, right, sort of caught on and is a thing we do is actually because the Crusades happened in the same period, 1,000 years later, or less than 1,000 years later, I guess. But anyway, so they all died from Passover to Shavuot in this time period. Amar Rav Chama bar Ava v'item Rabbi Chia bar Avin, kulam metu mitara. Not just they all died in this one period, right? The original story says the perek achad. So now we're telling us which perek between Passover and Shavuot, the period of the Omer, we can call it, and we'll see a connection to the Omer itself later on, which is interesting and creative. So they all died in this one period, and now we have an addition who says, and they all died a bad death, right? Mahi, what's the bad death? Amar Rav Nachman Askara. Askara, here it's translated as diphtheria. I actually do not know what askara is. I'm sure somebody has studied it in depth, meaning like it will be translated as diphtheria here, and by the Quran itself elsewhere, I believe it's translated as croup. It seems certainly like most of the commentators think that it's like a respiratory ailment, let's say. And it's very bad. And it's a thing that rabbis talk about in a lot of places. So, right, so they all have this terrible death, right? And it all happens in this very short period of time. There's no mention here of Lag BaOmer, right? And I think that's one of the things that that much I knew, but I was like, oh, but I'm sure people are going to talk about like why Lag BaOmer. But it turns out the Lag BaOmer thing is actually, as we'll see, kind of as we won't see, but as I'll mention, Lag BaOmer comes in as an important date in Sphira quite late. So there's actually not as much on it as I expected. So I learned something new about that, at least. Here's the Kohelet Rabbah version of this story. Like Kohelet Rabbah, I'm guessing just based on this is a relatively late midrash. So Rabbi Akiva, here it's put in the voice of Rabbi Akiva. Shnei Masar Apayim, right? Here it's not 12,000 pairs, 24,000, 12,000 students. Talmidim hayulim givat bad, right? I had these students from this place to this place, right? And they all died ben Pesach Latzeret, right? It's sort of integrating the multiple layers of our Gemara into one story. Rabbi Akiva is talking, and it's not saying they all died at one time. Oh, what time was that? Pesach Latzeret. He's just saying they all died between Pesach Latzeret, and in the end, I got 7 more, and it's like the list is slightly different, and we don't have to worry about that. But I just want to sort of point out. And then here he says it's not people sort of dissecting the situation. It's Rabbi Akiva saying to his later group of students, Amar lahem, harishonim lo metu ela mipnei shehayta einehem tzara batorah zelazeh. Right? Above we said, lo nahagu kavod zelazeh, maybe they didn't treat each other with respect. Here it's they only died because their eyes were narrow, which is a rabbinic expression for a lack of generosity in all of its manifestations, right? A lack of generosity of spirit, a mean-spiritedness, a stinginess. It could be a sort of a competitive spirit also, right? The opposite could be like ayin yafa, as we have in Pirkei Avot, right? So they only died because they had a sort of a narrowness towards their fellows. Atam lo tiyukein. You guys don't be like that. Meaning it's a little bit of like closing the barn door after the horror. Like the first set of people, there were so many of them, they all had this one fatal flaw. So like, don't do that. Of course, maybe you'll have some other fatal flaw, but don't do that, right? Miyad amdu umilu kol eretz Yisrael Torah. And they filled the whole land of Israel with Torah. There's something interesting to be said about the locations that keep being mentioned here, but I'm not sure what it is. So, right, so here it's sort of a reworking of our Gemara into this fluid statement of Rabbi Akiva, right? Like, I got it wrong the first time, but you guys get it right. So I wanted to sort of take this in 2 directions, which I think will crisscross with each other. One is a little bit to talk about what is Askara and where else does it appear, right? The nature of this plague and where else does it appear in the Talmud and maybe rabbinic texts. And the other is to think a little bit about other elements of this story, right? Meaning there's not so many details, right? There's Pesach Tatzeret, there's Askara, there's 12,000 or 24,000 students, the fact that they're in pairs, and there's that they didn't lo nahu kavod or einehem tzara, they had some sort of like interpersonal problem. And that's basically what we have. So I want to look at the Askara thing first, but we'll look at some of the other things and some sort of comments of, let's say, the last like few hundred years that try and synthesize this into some sort of a message. Okay. And by the way, right, again, there's no mention of Lag BaOmer. When we get to the first text that mentions Lag BaOmer and what it entails, I'll do a little background on that. So here's a Gemara from the Tanchuma. It also has a parallel in Brachot. I don't know which of those is older, actually, right? So it's reading this pasuk, Matzah Isha Matzah Tov, or La'it Mitzvah, sorry. Zomita, right? In a time of death when thou mayest be found, is pasuk. I actually left out the citation here, I'm sorry, right? This is the time of death. Amar Rabbi Ishmael, Tisha me'ot shlosha minei mitahin. There are 9,900, and 3 different kinds of death, which is like an interesting number. I'm sure it comes from somewhere. We're going to see in a second, right? Shenemar lamavet totzaot. Totzaot, bigematria hachihav, right? The word lamavet totzaot means, and unto the Lord belongs issues of death. You could
That's sort of what it means in context, right? But totzaot means how many there's the numerical value of totzaot is 903. How many types of death are there? Now I'm trying to do that quickly in my head. That could be true, right? Right. The kashesh bekulam, the worst of them all is askara. The tovash bekulam nishika, right? They translate it as the most painful. I would say, right, the worst, right? It's not actually specified why it's the worst. The tovash bekulan nishika, and the best is the kiss, right? Is anyone familiar with this idea of like the kiss of death? Right, like sort of the a lot of, like Moshe, Aaron, and maybe Miriam are said to have died through nishika, which is basically just sort of like God removes your life force is associated with your breath, and God removes it in a painless way, right? And if askara is a respiratory ailment, it's a very painful way to lose your breath. So that seems to be what's sort of happening here. But doesn't tell us why you get askara in general. It just tells us that it's really bad, right? So above, when we say mitara'a, askara, it's exaggerating or expanding on the negative thing, right? There was like this very exaggerated number of students and they had this very exaggerated death in a short period of time. Okay, so here's a Ben Yehoyada. I will admit that I have neglected to find out this person's biography before I came here, although I intended to. I want to look at the middle one. I did this translation, which you're welcome to look at your leisure. Maybe we'll come back to some of it at the beginning. Oh yeah, that sounds about right. With the Ben Ish Chai, who is sort of his commentary in Agadata. It's one of the few commentaries in Agadata. I thank you. Thank you, Chai, for suggesting that. Okay, so Kulan Netu Mitara'a. He's interested in what makes it Mitara'a, right? It doesn't seem like it's about the level of painfulness, but rather this. Hakavana, anybody who loses their koach hadibur, their power of speech at the time of their death, right? Because they can't sort of speak, meaning litzavot, to sort of set their affairs in order. Zoni kret mitara, that's called a bad death, which is sort of like a little bit, it's something for us to think about, like in our age of medicalized death, that's almost like the default, right? That people usually have several days where they can't communicate, right? Or very often. So that's something that's kind of like an interesting observation, but I don't know what to say about it. So what makes askara bad? It's not that it's painful. The fact that it has to do with your mouth, right? It's not just that it's like the opposite of a kiss, which is painless, and askara is painful, but that, right, the kiss of death means that you sort of retain your full faculties until the end. And this means even if your mental faculties are there, you can't communicate. Right? Sort of their power of communication was taken away, right? Which maybe, if we want to imagine it as sort of a midah keneged midah, like a tit for tat kind of punishment, fits in with the idea that, right, their interpersonal abilities, proclivities were lacking, and they're sort of like their death sort of hits them in that place, in the place of connection with other people, meaning their ability to communicate. It's possible. Right. And the last thing he says, right, which it's always interesting when people do and don't ask this question, but he says, listen, like, right, excuse me, right, you say 24,000 people died because they weren't nice to each other. Like, lots of people are not nice to each other. Usually we don't think that like involves, like, merits a torturous death, right? It's sort of a weird, like, they all died because, I don't know, right? Like, it's a strange, on some level, it's a strange thing to say, especially if I think many of us reading a story like this are already kind of taking a step back and being like, this is an allegory with a message, right? But if you're trying to take it as like, this is what really happened, right? This thing happened and the correct response in real world history was this, then like, that's actually kind of intense, right? Like, I like expelled the entire 9th grade because some of them were chewing gum. Like, no, right? So he says, what's that? It's not that the actual sin My mother's laughing because she knows I wish I could. No, I do not wish I could. But right, like it's not that the actual activity is a problem, although maybe the actual activity is itself a problem, but the real problem is the follow-ons from the lack of respect or sort of the narrowness of spirit that they brought to each other, which is that they desecrate God's name because, and we're going to see this later, because they're Torah scholars, right? That in some ways the standards for Torah scholars are higher. Okay. This Gemara about, this is the lead-in to a very famous Gemara. So far, right, we have our story. We have one sort of quasi-allegorical interpretation that talks about, right, they're being punished by the loss of their verbal faculties because maybe they misuse them. I'm leading you somewhere by saying that. I know it's not directly in there, and that there's something about their status maybe that makes even their minor infractions bad. So here's a Gemara from Shabbat. This is a lead into a very famous Gemara, which some people may recognize by the very end. And that's okay. We'll talk about it when we get there. I think it's probably not an accident. It's a good question. Why do I think it's minor? So I don't think it's minor, but we usually don't think of it as a death penalty infraction, right? Maybe that's like a problem with our whole frame of mind, right? I'm responding to Viva's question in the chat. Thank you. Right? Maybe we should think like, yeah, being mean to people is worse than most of the things we call death penalty infractions. But like in the end of the day, we usually don't say that. Especially the way it's framed in the Bavli of lo nahagu kavod. It's like it's not even that they were eineihem tzara, right? They were sort of actively narrow against each other, but that they weren't respectful. Yeah, that's pretty bad, but it's usually, I don't know. I think maybe what you're getting at is that there's a collective, right? That if you look at this as a collective attribute, it's actually extremely harmful. But if you look at it as an individual attribute, I mean, it might be one of the things that you wish least for the people you love, but is it the kind of thing that we say like, yes, death penalty or like life in prison for being mean, right? Usually we look for like more concrete manifestations of it. Right. It's very interesting, right? That like pandemics are inherently communicable and communal, but in a sort of a negative way. And that like, yeah, thank you, Viva. Okay. So here's our Gemara about Askara also, which is sort of bearing in mind that Askara may have sort of like a symbolic quality because it has to do with your mouth and power of speech. Let's read this a little bit. So there's a Braita that says, right, Arba'a simanin hein. 4 things have signs. Obviously, there's many kinds of signs, but this is 4 that are collected in the context of what came before here. Siman la'aveira hadrokan, right? Hidrokan is like, I don't even know, right? It's some kind of a bad thing that could happen, and it means that people are doing sins. Siman l'sinat chinam yirakon. A sin of gratuitous hatred is jaundice, right? Which is kind of interesting. First of all of these sins are related to each other, right? But gratuitous hatred is sort of, if we think about jaundice as sort of your, a lack in yourself that like reflects the fact that you're sort of projecting something onto someone else, right? Siman legasut haruach aniyut, right? When you find people who are poor, it's really probably because they're being punished for being arrogant, right? I mean, like, listen. I saw a face. It's fine to make a face. I think in general, right, the whole project of like describing like what sins must have occurred in order for people to be suffering is one that we are not always so familiar with, and it's much, or sort of comfortable with, and it's much easier when we're talking about something where we're not even sure what it is, right? Askara, that's like great, because then it's like it becomes just this like stand-in where we can talk about ideas. So I do want to like acknowledge that, yeah, like maybe it's not comfortable to talk this way about real afflictions that real people suffer, but let's think about Askara as like a literary device for now, right? So Siman Lashon Hara Askara, right? A sign of slander is Askara, meaning Askara is a thing that happens when people are, or Lashon Hara, I mean, it could be in the Talmud, it doesn't just mean slander the way we think of Lashon Hara, but in general, bad speech, right? And so it seems to be keying into what the Ben Ish Chai talks about, or the Ben Yehuda, talks about like, verbal things coming from your ability to breathe. And now we have, actually, that's one view. And there's another view that's like a completely different approach to this, which is Askara balalam maser. Actually, like Askara comes because people don't separate tithes, which is in some ways like a much more technical view of it. Although you could think of tithes also as some sort of a communal obligation, right, that we have to each other, depending on who's getting them, right? That like when people are so sort of
self-centered or not willing to share, then that's when you have these problems, right? Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi Omer al Lashon Hara, right? So here's a different braita. One person says it's because of tithes, one person says it's because of Lashon Hara, and Rava, or maybe Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, "My kra'ah v'hamelech yismach b'Elohim yitalel kol hanishba bo ki yisacher pi dovrei sheker." Right, so yisacher there means shall be stopped, I guess, right? The mouths of those that speak lies shall be stopped, but theory is you shall be askarad, right? If you speak wrong, you're going to get askara. Okay, and right, and again, like hinting at this idea that askara stops you from talking, right? So it's sort of like a tit for tat kind of situation. Okay, ibayalahu, right? So they asked a question, just in general, ibayalahu is going to always have two possible answers. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi al Lashon Hara ka'amar. Oh, Dilma, af al Lashon Hara kamar. Right. So here's a question in the interpretation of Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi, and the second braita says, oh, it's for Lashon Hara. Right. Did he mean it's only for Lashon Hara, or did he mean it's also for Lashon Hara? Tashma k'shenichnesu rabbeinu lekarim b'Yavne hayashem Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Shimon. Right. So when the rabbis sort of gathered in a vineyard in Yavne, right? This is the reconstruction of the whole rabbinic edifice after the destruction of the temple and all the sort of like the time of the Mishnah when they've sort of been almost defeated by the Romans and they're really in a bad place, right? And these are some of our heroes from the Rabbi Akiva second generation or second group of students. Right? It was asked before them, right? Why does this sort of plague begin in the intestines and end in the mouth? Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, who was the head, so Nana, Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, Rosh HaMedabrim B'chol Makom, who was called the first of all of speakers in all places, which we will talk about in a minute, right? This sort of kinoi, nickname for Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli becomes the hook for the story that's going to follow. Right? It ends with your mouth because basically, right, the seat of thought is thought to be like in your kidneys. So a disease that sort of begins from your intestines and ends in your mouth is parallels to the idea of sort of like the production of bad speech, which begins with your thinking. I'm pointing to my kidneys, but you can't see that, right? Begins there and sort of works its way up your body. Okay. That's why, right, the disease sort of, it parallels slander. Very similar ideas in the Masechet Sota, which I'm trying to learn lately, about sort of like the, whatever happens to the Sota, the sort of woman who's suspected of adultery who has this sort of trial by ordeal situation. Whatever, that's like a big Pandora's box to open, so I'm going to close it. But right, like that, the Mishnah talks about how, right, like the physical, whatever physical undoing she goes through is supposed to parallel the things that she did wrong in some sort of very like methodical way. So we have that here also, right? The Askara sort of methodically parallels the production of Lashon Hara, of bad speech. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi v'amar mipnei she'ochlin ba dvarim tmeim. He says actually, like, no, like forget this Lashon Hara thing. It's because you use your mouth to eat bad things, right? To eat non-kosher foods. Dvarim tmeim salkadatach. Really, you think it's like Askara is caused by non-kosher food? Ela she'ochlin ba dvarim she'einam metukanim, right? Meaning, like, so again, right? In some ways, what we're looking for with Askara is something that everybody does because everybody gets Askara when it comes around. So it can't be that everybody eats treif. But it could be that everybody eats food that wasn't properly tithed. So maybe that's what it means. It comes from the sin of dereliction of the study of Torah, right? So what this suggests, right, is that it wasn't only Lashon Hara. It's a bunch of things, and Lashon Hara is among them, right? And each of them we can kind of explain what this does. Of these things, right, Lashon Hara feels the closest to what we've said about the students of Rabbi Akiva. Right, that they were not respectful to each other and they had ayin sarah against each other. They were kind of like mean-spirited. It certainly seems to be the closest, but okay. So we have this whole thing. Well, how can you, it can't be that dereliction is a study of Torah because women get Askara and they don't have to study Torah. Well, it must be that they cause other people to be mevatel Torah. What about non-Jews? Well, they all same answer. Okay, I'm gonna sort of skip this. Right, and then basically they prove that it can't be the lack of the study of Torah that brings Askara, because even school children who do study Torah still suffer from Askara. Okay, which is sort of like an interesting, like it's framed as like this legalistic kind of debate, like, oh, I have a case that proves that your rule can't be true. But it's also in some ways a little bit of like a theodicy kind of thing. Like, you know, it's taking very seriously the project that we can ascribe causes to these forms of suffering, but then it's like I'm looking around, those don't seem to be the thing. Like people seem to be good, right? Even good people are dying. So now we're going to have an answer to this, right? Why does it look like, even though we're finding all these causes about why this most terrible of all deaths come to the world, that it seems to catch up good people also, even people who study Torah, which in the Talmud Bavli is like the most important thing, right? We tend to think of that as just in general in Judaism. It seems, some people argue perhaps somewhat convincing that it's really like the Bavli is the text that is the most preoccupied with the idea that Talmud Torah is like really the only thing and everything else is kind of secondary, which is, I think, both empowering and also sometimes a little overwhelming and maybe not, can have some negative consequences. So I don't know how I feel about that. I'm not trying to belittle it by saying it's just the Bavli, but that is what it is. So Hatan could Rabbi Gurion, to Amar Rabbi Gurion, V'ite Rabbi Yossi. Okay, we have a dispute as to who said it. Bisman Tzadikim Bador, Tzadikim Pasin al Hador, right? If there are righteous people in the generation, they're the ones who suffer for the sins of the generation, right? And if there are no righteous people, then children suffer. And this is why you could have children who are innocent, right? Sort of by definition, according to the Torah, right? They're not responsible for their actions and they're learning Torah, which they don't even have to do, but they're doing it anyway, right? They don't have to do it because they don't have to do anything, right? They're children, right? And that's how you could have them dying, because they're sort of like the vicarious stand-ins for the sins of the generation, right? Again, right, not like ideas that all of us may love, but it does seem, meaning even in our sort of more mechanistic understanding of suffering, it is often true, right, that like innocent people suffer because of the choices that other people make. So, you know, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Iri, right? So we have this idea. What is this pasuk, right? Right? Okay, the lambs are taken. He's reading it to support this idea that the children can be taken because the shepherds have done something wrong. Right? So from this we can learn Shema Mina Af al Lashon Hara. We can learn here that when he said Lashon Hara, he didn't mean only Lashon Hara, he meant also Lashon Hara. Okay. To me, this whole journey has been interesting for all the things that we brought up, not because of like, is it only Lashon Hara, is it not only Lashon Hara, but because of, right, like that argument structure of only Raleigh, Bailahu, this or that is actually like a way to bring in more text, I think, in some ways. Right? So we've brought in these things. We've brought in the idea, first of all, right, that it's a punishment for Lashon Hara. Maybe it's a punishment for abandoning Torah. We might say maybe for doing Torah the wrong way. I'm putting that on here. And it's also something where the people who die are not necessarily the people who sinned, right? Okay. Right. And now here comes our story. This is the beginning. I didn't include the rest, right? Remember I said, right, we have this nickname for Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai. Why do they call him Rosh Medabrim B'chol Makom? He's the first of the speakers in every place. Well, here's a story, right? Does anyone know where this is going? Well, you see it in front of you, right? So Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon were sitting, and Yehuda, the son of converts, sat beside them. Rabbi Yehuda said, right, so Rosh Medabrim B'chol Makom means he's the one who started this famous conversation, right? And this conversation has many, many fallouts, as we'll talk about in a second, right? So he said, right? Like the Romans are actually not so bad, right? What have the Romans ever done for us? But he was like, the Romans have done so much for us. I feel like the older I get, like the less Monty Python references land, but that's okay. The young people, kids these days, but it's okay, right? So he says, the Romans are great, right? Look, or not they're great, but they do some nice stuff, right? You got to hand it to the Romans, right? Tiknu Shvakim, they make these nice markets, they make bridges, right? The trains run on time, they make bathhouses. Rabbi Yossi was like, I'm not getting involved, right? He just said nothing, right? Which you could call siag l'chachma, right? A fence for wisdom. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is like, yeah, those things seem nice to you, but really they did them all for nefarious purposes, right? They make markets so that they can have prostitutes there, and they make bathhouses so that they can, because they're so hedonistic, and they make bridges so that they can collect taxes, the worst of all, right? joking, but right, like basically there's everything they do, yeah, maybe it works for you, but it's not good. You should never say that like they're doing okay, right? They're doing bad stuff. Some of it has like positive collateral consequences, maybe. Right? And then of course, Halach Yehuda ben Gerim, right? So we have the three rabbis who are speaking. The first one who speaks, right, is Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, who's the Rosh Midabrim. He's the first speaker, right? But then there's this fourth character, Yehuda ben Gerim, and it seems like not an accident that he's kind of like named in this liminal way, right? He's like Jewish, but he's not. His ancestors weren't Jewish, right? Maybe he has some, split loyalties. It's sort of suggesting, right? Meaning like, I'm not saying that because he's a descendant of converts he has it. I'm saying that that's why the text names him as a descendant of converts, because I think it's trying to sort of like suggest it about him. So right, he goes and he tells. So the story with that often remembers. Oh, he tells the Romans, but he doesn't tell the Romans, right? He tells someone else, like, oh, I just heard this really interesting conversation between three rabbis. I don't know if anyone here has ever been in this like situation where like, I remember this actually, the Drusha Summer High School program. I was not there, but I heard about this conversation. There was like, I'm not going to name the rabbis, but there's three rabbis, all of whom are like well known in their own right now, who like had this big argument about biblical criticism in like my second summer of the Drusha Summer High School program. And it was just like, we're all like, whoa, that was so cool. Already, we talked about it afterwards. So like, Yehuda ben Gerim was just like, I just heard this crazy conversation between three rabbis about the Roman Empire, right? And then, right, Nishma'u l'malchut. It kind of like, it gets back to the Romans, let's say. Amru, Yehuda she'ila yitaleh, right? It's interesting, his new name is Yehuda bar Ilai above, right? So he who praised the Romans, he should be raised up. Yossi sheshatak yiglel tzipori, right? Yossi, he didn't say anything. So like, we can't punish him, but we also don't like him because he should have said, yeah, you're right, they're awesome, so we're gonna exile him, right? Shimon shegina yehareg, and Shimon, who denounced the government, should be killed, right? And what story does this lead into? I didn't put it on the sheet, so it's like a pop quiz. Or you can put it in the chat as you wish. Right, and this is our Lag Bomer connection. Yeah. Oh, you guys can't unmute yourself. Maybe is that true? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead if you want to say something.
Oh, it's just the being in a cave thing.
Right. This leads to the story. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, he has to run away from the Romans. So first he hides in the Beit Midrash, but then he's afraid his wife is going to get tortured and give him up. And apparently he cares less about her being tortured than about her giving him up. So he runs away to the cave, right? And he has this whole like experience where he lives for 7 years on this like divine provision food. I'm telling the story very quickly. I assume many of us have heard it. If you haven't, I encourage you to read it another time. But right, you can watch videos about it, right? So he lives in the cave. This is when, according to the mystical purists, right? Maybe he's writing the Zohar then, or he's experiencing the Zohar, or whatever you want to say, with his son. They bury them. They don't have even clothes. They're like buried up to their necks in sand to preserve their clothing only for davening, right? They have these like, God plants a tree for them. And eventually it's time to come out. They come out, and what happens? And this is important, right? They zap people with their eyes because they've been living in such an ethereal existence that they're so distressed to see people carrying on with ordinary life as if everything is okay, right? Like ordinary life is a waste of time, and really you should all be studying Torah all the time. What's wrong with you? So then God sort of says, hey, go back to the cave. I didn't take you out to destroy the world. And then they learn some lessons. Exactly the nature of their lessons is an interesting question for another time. Right. So this Askara thing, this whole Askara sugya, interestingly leads in, right, and like Askara, which maybe is a sign of speaking poorly or not learning Torah, leads into the story of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who seems like he does one of those things but not the other, right? He's very good on learning Torah. That's like all he does, right? He's not doing Bitul Torah. He's not so awesome. I don't know about Lashon Hara, like speaking ill of people. Well, he speaks ill of the Romans, but I think the Gemara probably thinks that's fine. But he's not so good at generosity of spirit as directed towards other Jews, right? Like, in fact, at the end, he meets Yehuda ben Gerim, right? So at the beginning, he's like zapping people. I mean this literally, like people burn when he looks at them, right? At the beginning, he's like zapping people indiscriminately. And at the end, he only zaps Yehuda ben Gerim, who was the cause of his problems, even though it seems like not totally intentionally, right? So Yehuda ben Gerim has done like actual Lashon Hara, and it seems like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is not outside of the realm of these interpersonal problems, to say the least, right? I guess this is the time to mention, right? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is also the person associated with the date of Lag BaOmer, which is the end of the plague, right? And that seems like kind of like a weird coincidence, right? That's the Yortzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, supposedly, and it's also right the end of the plague. How those things came about is like an interesting, I think, historical thing. I just learned yesterday. If you read this Printing Mistake and Mysterious Origins link from the Sparm blog, you can learn, which is where I found this text, but also there are many other things there. You can learn that apparently the association of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's death with Lag BaOmer seems to come from a printing error of the word samach for shemet, for like the day of his sort of like joy to the day of his death. Like the death thing is very, very late in terms of like this being associated with his death, which is maybe why it takes, there's not as much about it as you might expect. So an interesting question is Lag BaOmer the end of the plague or a pause in it? Big machloket, right? I think it depends who you ask, but people will say, right, maybe Lag BaOmer is like the end of, I forget who I saw this, maybe the Maharsha, I don't remember. He says, well, Lag BaOmer is like the end of the plague, the end of new people getting sick, but there's still the people who were already sick continue. Everybody stops dying on Lag BaOmer, then the people who are already sick continue to die afterwards. Which is like actually an interesting comparison to our moment where like people, right, you're not over a plague just because no or fewer people are getting sick, but it feels different than before when like everybody is like every day there's more people getting sick, right? So okay, so that's sort of like our broad vision. We have this pretty terse story of Rabbi Akiva and his students, and they have this interpersonal problem, which first of all, right, because they're Torah scholars causes, it's interesting, right? Like actually what the Ben Yehoyada says about, right, because they're Torah scholars, that's what sort of makes their sin even worse. It's kind of the opposite from what the Gemara seems to be assuming, which is like Torah scholars, even though they're not so bad, they take the blame, but really they're carrying the blame for everyone else. It seems like it seems to me like the first one is actually like more what the Gemara is saying, right? Like they were, whatever was bad about them, it's especially bad when it's done by Torah scholars. It has something to do with maybe Lashon Hara and with their way of relating to each other. Okay. So I wanted to read sort of like two quasi-allegorical understandings of this that sort of layer in the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai piece. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is one of like the good, right, the second crop, the better students of Rabbi Akiva, right? He's one of them. Has he in fact taken to heart this lesson of being, a kinder, gentler student of Rabbi Akiva, right? Is he in fact nice to people? Not so clear. Right. Maybe I should now that I'm saying it, maybe I should have included the whole story, but okay. Right. He's definitely has an edge to him. His son even more so, but even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? He has a real edge to him. He sort of sees people doing ordinary things like planting crops, and he's like, "What's wrong with you? Why are you wasting your time when you could be learning Torah?" Right? Not a particularly generous spirit, let's say. So here we're going to read this Mar Kohen, which I think is very interesting. I feel like this is from the 19th century, but I'm not sure. So he starts with this sort of question, which is, right, the Gemara says that the students of Rabbi Akiva died from Pesach to Atzeret, right? From Pesach to Shavuot. Shavuot is always called Atzeret in the Talmud, right? That's one of my favorite high school quiz things, right? Like, what holiday is Atzeret? Because like, they always guess everything but Shavuot. So, okay. Everybody thinks it's Shmini Atzeret, Sukkot, whatever. Anyways. Because Sukkot is called Chag. So like if you have a Mishnah that says Chag, Pesach, and Atzeret, nobody ever says Atzeret to Shavuot. Anyways, unless they pay attention in class, then they know. That's why it's a good thing to ask. So, and then they can read any Mishnah they want. So that was a little aside. Okay, so, right, he says, the Mishnah just said, or not the Mishnah, the Gemara just says from Pesach to Atzeret, right? But our mourning practices that we say are connected to this sort of period of dying don't begin on the first day of Pesach. They begin on the second day of Pesach with Lag BaOmer. Why is that? Okay, so he connects it to this story. So this, I think, is like a super creative connection. It's very interesting. I don't know if others make this connection. I only saw it here. Right, so that's the question as I underlined it there. He says, oh, this is connected to the story from Menachos, which I brought below. So I'm going to skip there for a second. Here we go. Okay, so the Mishnah teaches, this is if you want to see the original, which I think there might be some typos in here. I copied it from, I was just shaking. Did you guys see me? Am I okay? Okay.
I was like flush. So okay, if you want to see the original, you can see it here. I think that typing is basically okay. So here's the story from Menachot, and then we'll go back to see how he ties it in, and we'll see some elements that feel related. Okay, so the Mishnah is talking about korban mincha that's brought from the new crop before the sacrifice of the Omer, right? The period of the Omer in the Bible is the period from one grain offering to another. The grain offering of the Omer that's brought on the sort of the second day of Pesach to the offering of the Shtei HaLechem that's brought on Shavuot. So in general, right, there is a halacha, which may or may not exist in contemporary times, depending on who you ask, of Chadash, right? People are not allowed to eat, are allowed to eat grain from the new crop after the bringing of Omer and Pesach. But apparently sacrifices are not. Right, sacrifices are supposed to come after the Shtei HaLechem. That's what it sounds like from this Mishnah. I did not investigate so fully, so if I'm mistaken, I apologize, and I'm very happy to be corrected. The Mishnah said, right, if you bring the sacrifice after the Omer, but before the 2 loaves, it's fine. Rabbi Tarfon said, right, so here's Rabbi Tarfon in the Gemara asking the following question. The technicalities of this are not so relevant to us, right? Ma ben kodem la'omer lekodem shtei halechem, right? Why should it be different, right? If shtei halechem is the deadline, then who cares if you made like a different deadline, right? Amar lefanav Yehuda ben Nechemia, and Yehuda ben Nechemia said, Lo mimarta kodem la'omer shekain lohu tar milcholo etzel hedyot tamar kodem l'shtei halechem shetar milcholo etzel hedyot. He's like, oh no, there is a difference in these 2 deadlines because one of the deadlines has consequences for somebody. It doesn't have consequences for the temple offerings necessarily, but it has consequences for regular people who can now eat from the new crop. So that's why, after the fact, but b'diavad, it works also in the temple. Okay. Shatak Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was silent. Tzahavu panav Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemia. So they translated it, Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemia's face brightened. I translated below as yellow just because I was like, well, I'll be the most literal possible since I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it's a bad thing, whatever it is, right? Rabbi Tarfon didn't say anything, right? Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemia thought he's like doing a great job in answering this question. And then Rabbi Tarfon kind of gave him like the look of death. And then he was like, oh, I have done something wrong. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva says, Yehuda tzahavu panecha sheheshafta et zakein. Right, your face has sort of changed like this. You're embarrassed basically because you answered back to somebody older than you, meaning Rabbi Tarfon. I don't know if it's Rabbi Tarfon was asking an open-minded question, but you weren't supposed to answer him with a tone of authority, or whether maybe he was sort of asking a rhetorical question and he was going to answer it, but you interrupted him. It's not clear to me which of those it is. But in any case, Yehuda ben Nechemia seems to have spoken out of turn, right? And because he spoke out of turn, he says to him, "Tvehani im ta'arich yamim." I will be surprised if you last long. Okay, which is pretty intense. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli, and Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli, right, our guy from above, the Rosh Medabrim B'chol Makom, right? Oto HaPerek Prasa Pesach. That was Prasa Pesach was like 15 days before Passover. Prasa is like half a month, right? So that was like in the pre-Passover period that they were studying the laws of the Omer, which makes sense, right? You sort of learn things as they're coming up in the calendar. And when I came back for Shavuot, Sha'alti Acharev. Yehuda ben Nechemia, when I was like, hey, where's Yehuda ben Nechemia? I haven't seen him around. They said he passed away and left this world, right? So in fact, Rabbi Akiva's prediction, as it were, comes true, right? That Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemia, because he spoke out of turn, let's say he ends up dead. Okay, so what connections do we have here to our situation? And we have a bunch of pieces that overlap. We have overlapping people, right? We have, well, people can say or maybe put in the chat if you want, right? Rabbi Akiva is an obvious connection, but there could be a little more. I just looked at the time, so I'm just going to say, right, we have Rabbi Akiva having a student, his student who does something wrong, let's say like Big Adol, he does something wrong, maybe he speaks out of turn, right? There's something wrong with his interpersonal, like sort of sensitivities, and the student dies as a result, right? That's sort of like the overall, maybe those are the connections, and some of our people are connected also, right? As I mentioned, right, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli, who's sort of like the survivor who lives to tell the tale, right? Similar to in our Gemara, where he's one of the 5 who sort of, I think, right, who's the second generation of Talmidim. So let's go back to the Marikoy, right? So he retells this story. And right, so his question is, why does the mourning period start with the second day, with the Omer, as opposed to with Pesach, when the Gemara says from Pesach to Shavuot? So then he retells the story from Menachot, and then he says, Mizenira, Kodim Pesach Tepap Yom. It was 15 days before Passover. I'm going to read the English because I wrote it, and yeah. And they were discussing the matters of the Omer, right? Because that's normal. And because Yehuda ben Nechaniah's face was yellowed because he answered back to Rabbi Tarfon about this, Rabbi Akiva was harsh. The word I use harsh to translate kapad, right? He was sort of exacting. Kapdan is like somebody who's kind of like overly exacting, right? Let's say he's like a stickler. I don't know what you want to say about it, right? So Rabbi Akiva took him to task for this, right? About his behavior during the studying of the laws of the Omer. And he said, right, it turns out that it's logical to say that when the time of the actual implementation of the Omer arrived, that's when this sort of like, basically like the bad feels that Rabbi Akiva had unleashed into the world surrounding Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemiah, about their study of the Omer, sort of came back to rest during the time of the actual Omer, right? They sort of like Rabbi Akiva's words, where he says, you're not going to last long, sort of come back to actually be put into place at the time of when sort of like the theoretical halachic discussion becomes practical. Which is kind of like an interesting idea that the whole idea of the way what you're talking about sort of has a time and a place that it's attached to, right? It's interesting, right? Right? Okay. And since Rabbi Akiva haya almad tamido Yehuda ben Nechemiah hitkabed b'tshuvato Rabbi Tarfon, right? How does he identify his sin? He hitkabed. Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemiah, right? The student who spoke out of turn, hitkabed. He's sort of self-aggrandized, right? And he velo nahag bo kavod. You can see he's starting to mix the language of the two sugyas, right? He spoke out of turn and he didn't treat him properly, right? The phrase lo nahag kavod comes from Argamar and Yavama, right? The students didn't teach it properly, treat each other properly. Right? And so like the sort of Rabbi Akiva's issue with him kind of comes to fruition during the time of the laws that they were studying. Right? Shaber he pashtak pedat Rabbi Akiva gam al kol tamidav shelo nagu kavod zelzeh. Right? Rabbi Akiva sort of his taking issue with one student who was disrespectful, which therefore sort of like happened at this particular calendar time, spread to everybody. Right? This seems related to me to the rabbinic idea that like once you release the destroyer into the world, right, it's going to kill everybody. It comes up in the 10 plagues. Why do the Jews have to put this thing on their house? Can't God just say like know where they are? Right? The answer is that like destruction has a larger power than you imagine. Right? It doesn't just take the people who deserve it. Right? It could kind of take a wider, or the people who are initially the ones who bring it upon the world. Let's say it expands to a wider circle. So like basically this story of Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemiah, thanks so much, right, becomes like the type story of Rabbi Akiva, sort of almost brings it down upon his own students. He says, like, you know what, you guys are actually not doing what you're supposed to do, right? You guys, like, erase, start again. So I think that's like, it's kind of interesting, right? And then he's going to connect it to Rashbi, right? Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai was one of the students, and he was very harsh, right? He was a big kaptan, right? He was not a warm and cuddly person. He was mean to people, especially when he came out of the cave, right? At least the first time. So he says, right, you might have thought, oh, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, since we know that his death happens during this period, albeit many years later, we might have thought he's also being kind of like, this I don't want to call it curse, but this sort of like utterance of Rabbi Akiva is catching up with him too, right? So you might have thought that that's catching up with him too. So it goes out of its way. The reason we celebrate the Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai on Lag BaOmer is to say like, no, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, right? He was not included in this bad death of the students of Rabbi Akiva during this time that's sort of connected to the time of the Omer because that happens to be what was being studied or whatever, right? He was different. Lo hayta, right? Mikol makom, lo hayta. Right? He was not interested in self-aggrandizing at the sake of someone else, right?
Chas v'shalom, God forbid. No, that's not possible. The Rashbi hayat tzaddik amur. He was like a total tzaddik, right? The karkatento, but it doesn't mean that he was like a fluffy teddy bear, right? He was still a very harsh person. But what was his harshness about? Right. What was his harshness about? His harshness was all for the glory of God, right? So there's some sense here, right, that like it's it's not the midah itself of being unkind, for example, that's the problem. It's the sort of personal motivations for it, right? The selfish motivations or the self-aggrandizing motivations that he's sort of calling out among the students of Rabbi Akiva. I agree with Viva, right, that it's not, these aren't really why do the righteous suffer texts, right? They're much more interested in telling you that the people weren't really righteous, so it's okay. Or not okay, but like, don't worry, right? The justice of the universe is not upset because the people were not really righteous, right? And how do we feel about that? I don't know, but I think that that's a good observation, right? That like, right, that in some ways this is a weird plague, and the plagues we're going to look at. So I guess I'll just say briefly, right? The plagues we're going to look at hopefully the next 2 weeks, right? Talking about the plagues in the Bible and what we can make of them. They're also things where like the people did a bad thing, and it's sort of like the plague is in some sense justice, but it just feels like it's going too far. But it comes down for a real reason, at least in sort of the mind of the text itself. So this was just one example. I guess I'm not going to get to the second one, but I encourage you to read this nice thing from Ariel Mays. You can follow the link if you want to like a larger thing about Lag BaOmer. As sort of Lag BaOmer happens to be in the Kabbalistic understanding of the days of Sphira. It's Hod Shebahod. It's like it's the 5th day of the 5th week. So like he quotes a Hasidic Rebbe who sort of talks about that. That it's a day for emphasizing humility. And like whether this is the actual picture of Rashbi or not, right? The idea that the Rashbi that we sort of valorize is the person whose humility and selflessness, even though he comes off as very severe or intense, right? But it's not for his own sake. And that's something that comes up in other rabbinic stories also, right? That like, so if you want to, if I'm going to answer my question a little bit, I said I'm not really going to answer the question, what stops the plague? But in some ways, right, what's the antidote to the plague? What's the thing that stops that maybe, even if it's a mistake, that it wasn't really the death of Rashbi, but like, in this whole mythology, what's the thing? What's the antidote? The antidote is some level of self-effacement or humility, right? The thing that brings it on is a sort of like inability to get along with others, right? Which comes from a level of maybe thinking too much of yourself, right? And thinking less of yourself allows you to live with other people. Not like thinking less of yourself, sort of putting yourself down, but thinking the appropriate amount less of yourself, that like God is more important than me and other human beings are not less important than me. That's what allows sort of people to live without like a communicable disease ravaging through that. I mean, again, I'm not trying to offer this as like an actual like public health etiology of disease, which is, if that's not clear, but I think that sort of like the way they're conceptualizing it, I think is kind of interesting. And also one interesting thing about this, which we'll see a little bit in the biblical text also, is how like an original story of a plague, which is like they did this bad thing, this thing happened to them, right? And we rebuilt, can lead to sort of layers of trying to understand it and unpack it in slightly different ways that are picking up on elements that were there, but maybe fleshing them out in other ways. It's 9:02. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see many of you next week.
All right. Wow. So thank you to Ms. Gedwiser for a fabulous class. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We truly appreciate having you as part of Drisha's learning community. Our spring programming will continue tomorrow. And if you're interested in joining ongoing, or we have one more new class coming up, you can learn about it at drisha.org/classes. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful